It's good to be with you, and I appreciate JP's invitation to be here with you. I was honored some years ago when JP hosted Phil Collins at his offices, who was presenting his book about the Alamo artifacts, and that's when JP and I first met. 10 days ago, we were at the San Jacinto banquet leading up to the anniversary, and JP gave a wonderful program about Tejanos in the Revolution. So I know he has a special passion about that particular part of the story as well. And I'm honored to be with you, descendants of such an important family, families, the Bryans and the Perrys and the Austins, with Joel and Austin and Guy and Stephen and Lavinia and Sarah, and the wives and the mothers and the grandmothers as well, and especially, of course, Emily Austin, Brian Perry, and what a great legacy this family has in Texas history. I myself am a descendant of the old 300, not more important than this family. We just got here a little earlier. But otherwise, I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about a book that I wrote on the old 300. I have some copies here. If afterwards you are interested, I'll be glad to sign and sell those to you. I also have another book, just if you'll pardon the commercial here. You may have noticed in that initial room for the tour that there was a photograph of this building shortly after the Galveston storm, showing the roof collapsed. And we know, many of us, the story of the tragedy of that. I wrote a novel, historical novel, on the Galveston storm some years ago, and it includes a chapter about the experiences there in and around the orphanage during the storm itself. So if you also have some interest in that, the book is entitled The Murder of William Marsh Rice. You may know Rice's name from Rice University. He was murdered by his butler. The butler did it. It occurred in New York City where he lived, but it happened exactly 2 weeks after the Galveston hurricane. And so I was doing some work on that, investigation of the murder and so on, and I just couldn't help myself. I mean, when you can write about a murder mystery and a hurricane at the same time, you know, I just can't pass it up. So I have a few copies of that as well. But I want to tell a story today from the old 300 experiences, one that may be familiar to you, sort of. And I say sort of because the story is often told in a very interesting way, but maybe not an accurate way. It's the story of the good ship Lively, the boat purchased by Stephen F. Austin in 1821 to bring supplies and early settlers to his colony. And the way the story is often told is that the good ship Lively, with its crew and passengers, left New Orleans, made their way towards Texas, but in a terrible storm sank and everyone was lost. That's about 20% true. The Lively did sink, but it sank a year after the events that we're going to talk about today, and everyone on the boat was saved. So it makes a great story. You know, don't let history get in the way sometimes of a really good story, especially in Texas, right? But I want to tell you what I think really happened to that first experience with the Lively. This was a boat purchased with the help of Governor Lovelace and William Hawkins, two good friends and sponsors, if you will, of Stephen S. Austin, to purchase this boat, to put supplies on it, and also a crew and passengers who were actually construction people. They were hired to go on this boat to help unload all these supplies, over 1,000 pounds of supplies, construction material, barrels of food, and so on, that would be let off there along the coast. And in the original plan that Stephen F. Austin's father had, they were going to place their capital right there on the coast at the mouth of the Colorado River. And they were going to name this little village Austina. Seemed to me they could have spent a little more time picking a name, but anyway. And that was the plan. And when, of course, Moses had passed away, Stephen picked up the mantle and the project. And this was the next stage along the way. As he was advertising for settlers to come sign the contracts to be a part of the colony, he had purchased this boat and had hired these 18 men under the proviso. The contract was they would make their way to the Colorado, unload the supplies, build a small little sort of outpost, and Stephen F. Austin would meet them there then some weeks later, and the process would then begin. Their job was then to do the building, the construction, and the first fields of corn to be planted in the spring of 1822. That was the plan. So late in November, the good ship Lively finally left from the harbor in New Orleans and made its way out into the Gulf. Now, we have actually some reminiscences, some letters and diaries and journals by a couple of the men who were on the boat that's still available, and they tell the story. And one of the first parts of the story was that they found themselves in the midst of a terrible storm, likely a tropical storm or a hurricane, somewhere off the coast of Louisiana. And one of the writers, talking about it later, said, "We were blown all the way to the Bahamas." I doubt that, but it was pretty far away. More likely maybe the Caymans, but anyway, they were set back almost a month before they made their way back finally to the coast. And then they moved their way along the coast, right here along Galveston Island. They came to the mouth of the river, which they believed to be the Colorado, and unloaded the ship, and the Lively sent off, actually headed to Matamoros to pick up some other supplies for another contract. But the idea was to set all of this at the mouth of the Colorado. And they had no idea that this wasn't the place where they were supposed to be. As far as they knew, it looked like the mouth of a terrific river. It must be the Colorado. And of course it wasn't. So you can imagine now that there are going to be some problems along the way. They unloaded the supplies. There were now 20 in this particular group. 7 in the crew went on with the Lively elsewhere. And they split up into 3 groups. One of the groups was going to stay right there with the supplies until Stephen F. Austin arrived. Another was going to go foraging up the river some for food and other supplies as might be necessary. And the third was going to make their way farther up this river, the Colorado, until they found Stephen F. Austin, who they presumed was coming back this way. This is January of 1822. Not the most pleasant weather on top of everything else, but the 3 groups headed their separate ways. Stephen F. Austin, by the way, is making his way down the Colorado to the coast to hopefully connect up with these people. And of course, they won't ever be there. And after some period of time, Austin is going to travel back up inland, figuring that the boat had been lost, and that was the end of that part of the story. It would literally be months before he would learn what had actually happened. So one of these groups began to make their way up the river. They made it a long way, and they came to a huge, literally bend in the river. It bends around almost back onto itself. It looks like a giant sort of omega when you look at it from a map. And this was fascinating to them, and they decided that at some point this might be a place where they could also set up a small outpost, a little bit farther inland than down there at the coast. So they returned back to the coast to see how things were going. Well, things weren't going very well, to say the least. And in the midst of this moment, this would have been probably early and mid-February, a group of people showed up at the mouth of the river. This was the David Fitzgerald family. Totally by coincidence, had been making their way down the coast and had now found people and supplies and food and were welcomed there to be a part of this. And in the ensuing conversation, we learned that the Fitzgeralds were from Mississippi Territory and that there had been some trouble there in which David Fitzgerald thought it might be prudent for him to leave the country for a period of time. Now, the rest of that story, by the way, is a few years later, you'll remember that in the original contracts that Stephen F. Austin had everyone sign, part of this, there were some very strict rules of who was not invited into the colony. For example, young single men, trouble, trouble, trouble. Preachers, trouble, trouble, trouble. And fugitives from the law. Anyone with a criminal record was not invited, was invited not to come into Texas for obvious reasons. And so a couple of years later, Fitzgerald, who had remained in Texas, was and had signed a contract, was visited one day by Stephen F. Austin, who said, "Oh, by the way, I just learned a little bit about your background. And I know that you were a fugitive from the law in America, and so you have to leave. You and your family must leave because you broke the rules." And they didn't. If you break one rule, I guess you break the other rules as well. And so Fitzgerald and his family stayed. You know, Austin had a lot of other things going by that time. And actually, Fitzgerald turned out to be a pretty good neighbor and a pretty good contributor to the early colony. But at this moment, he was just a stranger in a strange land and had met up with some people and was thrilled and relieved to do so. They went back up the river a little bit, and Fitzgerald came flying back from, he had gone ahead a mile or so, shouting that there were Indians on the warpath, and we must get out of here. Well, it turned out there weren't any Indians. There were a few campsites where some had been before, but it was a scare for no real particular reason. And they all had a little bit of, I guess, suspicion about Mr. Fitzgerald and his antics here along the way. Now, as they're continuing to wait and hang around and hope maybe that Stephen F. Austin was going to finally show up, another person showed up out of nowhere. This person was William Morton. And Morton had a terrible story that he was having to tell. And in this story, he had started bringing his family down into Texas, and they had been shipwrecked back on a larger island, this island, and he had left wife and children and a couple of servants back there while he went looking for help, not having any idea where he was going. And so, again, fortune smiled upon him as he ran into this group. And they decided that they would help him return to the island, several of them sort of rescue Morton's family, and then bring them along for the ride on the Colorado River, such as it was. During that particular excursion back to Galveston Island to rescue the rest of the Mortons, two of the original contract settlers drowned along the coast there. The first two real casualties, if you will, of Austin's colony. But they managed to get the Morton family and get them back down to their base of operations. But again, it's February, it's March, the weather is not cooperating. They're still feeling abandoned by Stephen F. Austin, not quite sure what's supposed to happen next. So they decided as a group, now a much larger group, to make their way farther inland. that if Austin wasn't going to meet them on the coast, that they would make their way until they found him or somebody up the river. And so they came back up to the bend. And at that bend, they decided to go ahead and build a little warehouse to store the rest of those supplies for the time being. And so they built essentially a kind of a dog-run cabin to put those supplies in. It was pretty modest along the way. And later, as the story continued to sort of circulate, people began talking about how they built a fort there at the bend of the river. It was never a fort. It was never meant to be a fort. But, you know, it's a good story also that you're building a fort down there along the way. And of course, that's where the term Fort Bend originated, and then the little town of Richmond built right adjacent to that little warehouse. And even today, people wonder where that might have been. The only clue we have is, if you know Richmond at all, there's the two bridges that cross, and the railroad bridge that cross the Brazos River right there. About 200 yards downriver from there is the likely location. And our clue is that there is a street that's been there a very long time called Fort Street. And it ends right there at the river. That's a clue that might have been at least in that particular vicinity. So literally months had gone by. Early on, in fact, as they were making their way originally along the way, they had come across what turned out to be a privateer, a pirate ship, right off of Galveston Island. And on shore, some people who had lost their own ship and were sort of shipwrecked there on the shore. This is before the Fitzgeralds and before the Mortons. And so they were suspicious of this privateer and decided to sort of be on the offensive. So they went to this privateer and said, we're here on behalf of the United States and we're looking for pirates. Have you seen any? And the pirate captain, Captain Roach, said, no, I don't know anything about pirates around here. And the next morning he was gone. On that shore, along with the abandoned people from their own shipwreck, was Jane Long and her child and the servant. And they were there waiting for James Long, her husband, to return with good news from his filibuster, which would never, of course, happen. They were invited to board the Lively and make their way to the Colorado, and she very kindly refused, saying no, she was going to wait there for her husband to return. He, of course, never did. She ultimately settled in Richmond, right across the river from Fort Bend, and became a neighbor to these folks who had originally at least invited her to come along. By the summer of 1822, we have finally met up with Stephen F. Austin, who by now has already chosen another place for his headquarters, farther up the Brazos, and the confusion, at least to some degree, had finally been solved. Of those original 20, besides the two who were lost at sea, 14 of those 18 returned to the United States, never to come back to Texas again, not after that experience along the way. Now, one little postscript to this story, back 50 years earlier, in the 1700s, when the first maps were being copied from early explorers, that goes back all the way to the late 1600s, one of the map makers in Mexico City, redrawing one of the original maps, switched the names of two rivers, the Brazos and the Colorado. So maybe they were lost, and maybe they weren't so lost. Thank you all very much for listening to this story. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, I guess we got a couple of minutes for questions or not. And again, I'll be hanging out here if anybody would like to speak with me or purchase a book or whatever. Yes, sir.
I think they have a lot of questions, David. So the first one is, how long did it take them to realize that they were not at the Colorado, that they were in fact at the Brazos River?
Not until Austin's emissaries found them at Fort Bend. Really? So that would have been May, probably. They'd been there 5 months.
Had they built any permanent structures?
They had not built any other permanent structures except for that little warehouse. But soon thereafter, by the summertime, once they realized what had gone on and where they were, then they started building some permanent homes, which became Richmond.
So when were the next wave of colonists after the 14 returned home?
Well, by the summer of 1822, they were coming from every direction. In the original 300 contracts, almost none of those people actually came to Texas who had signed on with Moses Austin. It was almost a completely different group that came over the next couple of years, but they came from everywhere. They came by land across the Red River. They came down the Mississippi and across to Nacogdoches and then down the Camino Real. They came straight over from New Orleans and just west right along what is today Highway 10. They came in small groups and huge groups and family groups, really straggling in from the spring and summer of 1822 until the summer of 1825. And that's where that part of the story ends, because there were 300 contracts and the family walked in and they were number 300. And so that was when that completed. But one of the important things, and this is also related to your family as well, there's still a line of people out that door who are coming into Texas. They were then number 301 and 302 and 303, and that was a separate contract that Stephen F. Austin then worked with the Mexican government. And then you had the other impresarios coming in, DeWitt and Robertson and so on. So literally thousands of families were pouring into Texas over that 6 or 7 year period of time before the law of April 6, 1830. So often our images of Stephen F. Austin sort of looking like Daniel Boone with this huge caravan of wagons and settlers making their way down, never happened. Austin himself personally brought 12 people to Texas. Everybody else came on their own.
So what happened? Do you know the names of the 4 people that did stay?
Well, William Little was one of them. William Morton, of course, and Fitzgerald were part of the other ones. James Lewis was one of the ones who stayed. And I'm going to have to think about that for a minute about the other ones. But they all became pretty good contributors to the development of Richmond along the way. Yeah. Yes?
What do you think what was the incentive for Moses and Stephen F. Austin to do all this? What was in it for them?
Well, to pay off their debts. The idea was that they would come to Texas, they would have this massive amount of land, and they would do these contracts where, it's a league and a labor, about 4,600 acres, where they would grant this 4,600 to this family and then 4,600 to the Austins. And then 4,600 to this family and 4,600 to the Austins. And at some point with 100,000 acres, they would then sell that off and pay their debts back in Missouri. Some of the settlers early on got wind of that, didn't think that was quite fair. They turned them in. There was some whistleblower, went to San Antonio and said, hey, I don't think that's right. And the local constabulary there at San Antonio came out, saw what was happening, and said to Stephen, you can't do that. So Austin had procured some acres, but never really enough to pay off their debts. Those debts went on pretty much into perpetuity. Yeah. That was the idea anyway, yeah.
What I'm saying, when he couldn't find him out in Colorado, he established another settlement. Was that San Felipe?
That's San Felipe, yeah. By that time, he had explored much of both the Colorado and the Brazos, as well as the Onion Creek and Buffalo Bayou areas, and had decided as an alternate to have something inland as well as the one on the coast, San Felipe was the best spot. And then it ends up being really the only capital that he established. The Brazos back then, and a lot of times, is pretty much navigable all the way that far up the river. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Expand on the confusion of the two rivers. How
Yes.
like Brazos- I've heard a story from my family. I would like to hear your story about how they got swapped and why would they swap?
Well, as I mentioned before, this was actually some Mexican cartographers copying maps that had been made by the De Leon expedition in the 1690s, in which they went all the way up practically to where Texarkana is today. And on their way back, they were looking for French sailors or anyone else that they could find. And on their way back, they decided to map this area, basically what is East Texas and Southeast Texas, and they named the rivers. And so that's the original map, and the Brazos, which means, wrapped in the arms of God, and then the Colorado, which of course means red. And so that was the way the maps were drawn for 50 or 60 years. But sometime in the 1700s, the maps that were then being drawn had swapped the two rivers. Yeah, and
It's so obvious.
yeah, really, yeah.
Across that red.
The Brazos is a lot redder than the Colorado, isn't it?
By the way, that account of De Leon trip all the way to Nacogdoches is in that case that you all were looking at. It's actually it's the cover of it. But
Right.
It's like a 56-page manuscript.
Yeah.
We have every early Spanish exploration, anything that was written, we have it all in the collections.
Yeah, and they were very meticulous about recording and mapping. Their maps were remarkably accurate for that period of time, literally drawn sort of on horseback as they're making their way along. But it turned out to be remarkably accurate maps. And then the maps that extended out as far as Santa Fe also became remarkably accurate and were used 300 years later by people heading for California for the gold rush. They used the old Mexican maps that were accurate enough to get them at least that far to the Rocky Mountains. Yeah. Okay, thank you all again very much. It's been nice to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.